Hey there, folks. Today we have a new work for you. Today we'll follow a protagonist who had a happy life alongside a childhood friend, only to, by the twists of fate, see this childhood friend meet up with a powerful, unknown guy. However, he and his childhood friend ended up deciding to betray our protagonist, abandoning him in the middle of a cave. He couldn't survive anymore, but to find out how he'll manage to survive, I'll leave this doubt in the air, as our hero will use everything at his disposal to try to survive a little longer, maybe 2 or 3 minutes in this dungeon, since he managed to awaken a light ability, one of the most useless abilities in this kingdom. With this biography in hand, we'll have to discover how this hero will manage to survive for a long time. This is a story that begins with Deja Vu, the mage, along with his team, in a distant and very dangerous place. With a pitiful face and a touch of villainy, he's introduced to us with anguish. He then lets out a crazy laugh and tells the defenseless boy below him that he was a fool and that he now realizes he was easily deceived by his own team. Next to the mage, we also see a red-haired character who was in a game of betrayal. She then says that from the beginning, she saw that boy as easy prey, and it would be a piece of cake to deceive him. She also mentioned that Agunil always acted with confidence and kindness. Meanwhile, from another place, we see the boy doing everything he can to fend off monsters that kept coming his way. Agunil then ends by saying he will leave everything up to that boy, as he is here fighting against some monsters. The boy tells his team to wait a bit, and with a seriously determined look, he then asks his companions if, from the start, they intended to use him as bait or, who knows, to basically use him to achieve what they wanted. The red-haired girl responds sincerely, saying yes, they saw the boy's magical power and that it was relatively high, so they made him the perfect bait for the undead, as those monsters are drawn to his light magic. The scene then cuts to the traitor group, where we see a monk making a hand gesture as a sign of gratitude, saying that the boy did Agunil a great favor. In the background, we see Agunil's silhouette as he tells them the exact place where they can find King Light. Now the boy here should become like those monsters still, as we see the boy giving his all to stay standing, casting light magic in the monster's direction, at least trying to defeat one of them. He manages to take them down one by one, but without much ado, we see the group leaving the place. They then bid farewell with an evil smile, and Agunil still mentions that with those light magic attributes, he should be quickly eliminated by those monsters, and that they'd have no trouble since he was useless. The boy shouts for them to wait, and again, he shouts with that hope that help will appear, but in the end, he was simply ignored. The scene then shifts to an alley with a narrow path where we see a strong, bright light, where the boy ends up thinking that he was closer than ever to the precipice, that now he found himself in total danger. After the protagonist's thoughts, the information on the lit is quite important, as he is in a pose of an SSS class, also known as a light staff. Then we go back to the past, specifically before the betrayal of the protagonist's group, and ahead we see a huge throne with a gleaming gemstone crystal at its peak. Just below, we already find an SS-class item. We then go back to Agunil, who tells the protagonist to hurry and look for the Rui he was seeking, and that he would be giving him good protection. So arriving at the location, we noticed that it was surrounded by coffins, which for some reason looked quite suspicious. And without delay, we then see the protagonist about to grab that staff. In the background, we still see them encouraging him to take that staff. This was the staff of King Light. And so it was done. As soon as the boy places his hand on that item, something begins to happen in the place. The magic crystal that was already above the protagonist's head is activated, causing various undead to suddenly appear in this place where our hero was. And only now, having grabbed the staff, the protagonist realizes how foolish he was to trust that certain person, or rather, his group. Now, with no place to run, he realizes he has found or is in the place where King Lit's rest lay. At that moment, he begins to run in another direction until he then finds Agunil. There, he was trying to deal with some of the undead that were appearing, but he yells for our hero to give him that staff. For with the staff, he would be able to adopt Relit. Thus, confident, he ends up grabbing the staff he had in hand and throwing it towards Agunil, who then quickly catches the staff. At that moment, after seeing this, he is surprised by something, that it could really save them. And now that he has managed to get the staff, she then begins to approach Agunil and asks that he, as well as her and her group, leave here quickly. In this moment, while he was lying there below, our hero wonders what is happening with him until Agunil turns in his direction and thanks him for his excellent work. But now he can no longer do anything, as the lit army flies towards our hero. But he used that light energy of his to try to push these monsters back. However, even so, it was of no use at all, as he only had level 6 light magic. This magic was only temporarily pushing the monsters away. And now he understands that no one cares about him anymore. Besides, he can't kill monsters with light magic, as light magic doesn't have a single attack point. He saw himself exhausted, but it was also unbelievable. The low-level adventurer like him was recruited by a promising group. Tiranar, the redhead, even made a pretty face to invite our hero. He then starts to get increasingly irritated, but now the skeletons were overcoming his light. As his light faded, he saw how foolish he had been to trust those people, the very people he once thought most trustworthy and strongest, who in the end turned their backs on our hero. However, now that he was about to die, he understands the real reason why they chose our hero. But this does not give him the reason and right to be literally abandoning him in the middle of this cave. Meanwhile, the skeletons advance in his direction. The protagonist, on the other hand, had no way to defend himself. But even so, he wanted to survive, and by any means, he would be surviving this dungeon. However, he ended up being hit by one of the skeleton's attacks, but with the light magic he still had, he used it to push the skeletons back. However, this no longer helped at all, as we observe here that the damage one of the skeletons caused him was very serious. He even begins to bleed while he was about to fall. He only has the memory of his group, smiling with an evil face in his direction, as he thought he still couldn't lose, as he couldn't yet be losing this fight. Here, we then observe him activating his last skill, his most powerful skill. He thought that with this he would survive until the moment when our system appears and tells us that there is an error in his level of magic light. The reason was simple. He now finds himself with an extremely powerful thing that gives him an extremely strong pressure. This thing that gave him all this pressure was our dear Lit, who woke up from his extremely long dream. Now he only has to accept his end. Then, the system appears again, showing us that he reached the superior level. Now he managed to unlock the attributes of light. He just doesn't understand. Then we observe the system again, showing that his light evolves. Now his light will be evolving to a lightning attribute. He doesn't understand evolving. This was totally new to him, because in this world, there are two types of people. These are those who fight with heavy weapons, like swords, bows, and other things, known as warriors, and those who use magic, producing fire or water, or sometimes even healing wounds. These are the mage types, but there are also other categories called attributes. Yet all of this is according to the will of the gods. For this, we need to go back 7 years to the day of the attribute test in a castle-type church. We then observe the boy approaching someone, saying that fire was strong, but she says that another ability was much better. However, she thanks Light. Light, without understanding anything, just turns red, but she asks some questions again. One of these was about which type of attribute he would be unlocking. Light, however, doesn't know which ability he would actually be getting. She thinks he would be unlocking fire magic. Then we observe her saying that Light has an extremely powerful attribute, and also, she doesn't care about which type of attribute he will be getting since he was the main star of everything. Thus, by unlocking his class, they could go on adventures together. Then a priest appears and asks the children to stay quiet and go check which type of magic they would be able to use. Soon, Light then understands that he should stay there to unlock his class. But she was already leaving and wishing good luck to our hero. In this world, there is something known as national attributes. When you turn 10, you can take the attribute tests. This is when the priest basically conveys the message to the gods, granting the young person, the one who would be gaining this ability, any type of magic. These can come as fire mage type, or earth type, or water type, or air type, among other abilities. Saya already obtained the fire ability. At this moment then, with this ability she had, they could even hold some sort of party to honor her new power. However, Light doesn't care about the party, but rather the message she left, saying that when they unlocked a good ability, they could go on an adventure together. Light is enchanted by her beauty, but then the priest asks the next one to enter. Our Light then enters without understanding anything. He observes a sphere in front of him on top of a table. Light then, in fear, starts moving a bit more than usual. After placing his hand on that sphere, the priest begins to reveal his ability, his combat magic. Ability was Light. Light is left without understanding anything. His end had practically arrived here. Then he calls the next one so that they could come in. But Light asks him to wait. He asks this priest not to joke around. He even asks if this really was his class. The priest then, in response, says that the gods do not make mistakes. At this moment, Light begins to cry, saying that the Light attributes were literally a useless ability. This makes the priest furrow his brow slightly and then ask Light if, by any chance, he was mocking the gods, and if by any chance he was making light of an ability given by the gods to our hero. He just wanted to become an adventurer. However, the priest said that light magic does not have offensive power, so it would be difficult to become an adventurer. Even so, the gods grant a special attribute for each one of them. Then, the priest raises his hand and approaches Light, asking him in the end to accept his destiny, which he ended up receiving. Crying, he ends up accepting in the end, whether he wants to or not, this thing. However, accepting it would be totally difficult. He wonders why he has a high magical power inside him. He didn't ask for much. He just wanted to request an attribute of a stolen ability, something like fire, water, earth, any one of them, since our Saya promised to go on a quite good adventure with our hero. However, this discourages him quite a bit, and he begins to fall into tears. Then, 7 years pass. We then observe someone entering a tavern. The one who entered was Light, our hero. The moment he enters the tavern, he thanks Mazina for basically giving him a good mission. Now, he is 17 years old and, in the end, has become an adventurer. Melissa gets irritated because he completed yet another mission. The mission he completed was basically too risky, until he says that he and his group went to the Goblin Tavern. He was just a luggage carrier, and everything went well for him. The girl said that Light did quite a good thing, and his teammates must have been impressed with his motivation to become an adventurer. For that, Melissa motivates our hero, saying that the guy who was part of his team was anxious and was basically paying attention to our Silver, saying that the guy was good with a torch. He only managed to do a few things like carrying some heavy backpacks while holding the torch and managing to scare off some monsters, but for him, it seemed like the opposite. That guy there was basically staring at him with a somewhat malicious intention. Then he asks that he ignore all of that and wonders if there's already a new recruitment so he can join a new guild, as after he awakened his attributes, he managed to acquire the light attribute and, in the end, became an ideal person for specific jobs in the orphanage. Then, knowing that no one was trying to recruit him, he ends up bidding her farewell, saying at that moment that he would be back some other time. However, with his high magical power, he is able to use another one of his abilities, which is the magical transparency that allows him to share a bit of his magical power with others. While he was having a good meal, some people commented that they found a magical tank that was quite useful. But since that day, our hero awakened his attributes, our Saya, for some reason, disappeared. Everyone became a little more distant. He wonders what they were doing at those moments while he was eating, and he ends up thinking that he was necessary as an adventurer as he was. But his abilities basically allowed him to complete only some weak missions that gave him rather good rewards. However, he still wonders if he's happy with this ability he has, and if he's happy with his job, which is just to guide a certain light and a dark moon, for he is only a light mage. While he was eating, We then observe something watching him from outside the window. Meanwhile, elsewhere, he receives a new mission. This mission in progress was the gathering of moonlight grass, which meant he could start searching for herbs. This herb was a medicinal plant at the guild he belonged to, one that could be sold for a high price. However, it could only be found at night, and considering the effort and lighting costs, it wasn't really worth it for irregular adventurers to hunt for it. Automatically then, with his light power, he could find this medicinal herb much more easily. After finding one, he begins looking for more until dawn. At this moment, he realizes that, alone, he's practically filling some bags with these medicinal herbs, achieving something that no one else in this world would be able to do. Now that he's filled one bag, he feels overjoyed, as he'll be earning quite a fortune upon reaching the guild. But as he starts walking, a notification from the system appears, showing that he leveled up his light magic power. However, when he checks the attack stat, it was still at 0. His expectations were that his attack power would increase at least by 1 point, but his hopes seemed to have been in vain. He had reached the maximum level for the light power, level 10, but the light attributes always capped at level 9. The main reason was that everyone thought light magic was completely useless. Hence, it was easy to level up light magic, as no one who possessed this skill had probably ever reached this level, but he did it. Nonetheless, our hero clung to a sliver of hope, thinking that maybe, if his light magic reached a high level, he might gain 1 attack point. However, to achieve that, he would need his light magic power to reach the maximum level. Thinking of his options, he realized he had come this far and that he could still be an adventurer, even at rock bottom. The only thing that kept our hero motivated was the memory of that priest telling him to embrace his fate, the destiny of carrying the light on his back. So he ignores his negative thoughts because now he is forging his own path as an adventurer. The day shifts, and we see our hero returning to the tavern. He calls for Maison, but Maison is somewhat surprised, finding something very interesting and thrilling news. She then thrusts a piece of paper in his face, which he doesn't quite understand why Maison is so happy about until he takes the paper. Maison explains that someone was specifically looking for people with a particular skill, which fills him with happiness, making him doubt if it could be real. Perhaps this person was looking for our hero, though he doesn't understand why such a powerful figure in this world would request him. Maison also can hardly believe it, as the adventurer rank of this group is at the top. They are in Class A, the highest class. Even though someone so powerful invited our hero, she still cautions him to be careful, as their adventure may not be entirely trustworthy. However, Light doesn't believe much in his own potential. He even thinks it might have been a mistake, that perhaps the people from this guild confused his name with someone else's. But Maison insists that he shouldn't undervalue himself, because the people from this guild came in person to check on his stats. One of the people who came to look for our protagonist was actually from the main capital. After all, someone from the main capital wouldn't leave just to look for someone like him. Hero, and they came to this small village apparently looking for a certain support member with high magical power. And guess what? Our protagonist has extremely high magical power, so one of the main motives is revealed. They might be looking for someone with a very high mana reserve. And since, in their group, there's basically a great sage among them. However, among their members exists this guy. But for this guy to use magic, he needs a lot of magic, and therefore needed someone with a very high magical power reservoir. At this moment, Melissa begins to smile. She's happy for our hero, seeing that someone is finally recognizing his real power. But Light, with some hesitation and doubt, still doesn't believe it. He doesn't yet have all that confidence, as his light magic was the only thing he knew how to use. Meanwhile, as they commented there, our hero starts to look a little closer at the paper, where he finds an adventurer who has a drunkard class. And he wonders why a guy with a class like that was participating in this guild. He asks Rod why he would keep going forward, but before he gets an answer, Melissa calls Light's attention. She then starts commenting to our hero that he has the highest score, the highest survival rate and mission completion rate in this guild. Not to mention that his contributions to gathering missions were also quite high. Perhaps this is basically one of the main points that gave our hero a pretty high reputation. And now that she brings it up, Light then starts to look a bit closer at this paper. And if it's really a ranking classification, they will definitely go into a high-level dungeon. He is no longer a beginner. Yes, he has to accept this offer, which basically seems quite good for our protagonist. However, Highlight still has that worry since maybe something dangerous will happen. While he was calling for Melissa, he was going to ask her a more than interesting question, but at that moment, a totally attractive girl ends up catching the attention of the clients in this bar. Meanwhile, Light starts talking to Melissa. One of the things he starts talking about is that he wanted to basically cancel that quest he just received. But before he can proceed, the girl then asks why he would cancel it. Light then turns around, but as soon as he does, he ends up finding a red-headed girl who suddenly jumps into his arms. Now close to his arms, our protagonist doesn't understand anything about what was really happening here and now asks who this girl was. She, totally shy, then starts looking a little more fixedly into his eyes. At this moment, she asks if he was an idiot. And if he was an idiot, he was terrible since he ended up forgetting who she really was, given that the two had been through many things and did many things together until then. Light is startled and tries to basically clear up the situation. He then turns to Melissa and asks her not to think or act strangely since he didn't do anything to her. Now he tries to understand what was really going on here now again. Then that girl was holding on to his arms more and more, but now he ends up asking her to back off and basically introduce herself. She then removes her hand from his arms and then backs off, saying she was just playing. And after that, she says that, well, he hasn't changed at all. After looking at his face a bit, we then observe our protagonist having a very clear memory of a certain red-headed girl. This was that childhood friend of his who lived with him in that orphanage. Light then remembered the last time he saw her smile. This was before the attribute tests, and he ended up leaving the orphanage a little earlier, completely distancing himself from her, and 5 years had passed since then. Light, distracted by his thoughts, ends up muttering that he was very happy to have found her. Light then smiled and agreed with this, then asked Saya what she was doing here. At that moment, Angil approached and announced that she had basically come here to do a... At hearing this voice from another person, Light began to freeze, feeling a shock. Looking at Angil, Saya also turned around, but unlike Light, she didn't smile and didn't have that surprise at Angil's appearance. Meanwhile, Angil spoke directly to Light, admitting he was happy to recognize our protagonist. Then he introduced himself, now announcing his title as the Silver Will team leader. Having said this, Angil closed his eyes and ended up smiling with that friendly expression. On the other hand, Light, upon hearing his full name, was paralyzed, not knowing how to react to what he was hearing here and now. Light then knew that Angil was the owner of the most advanced lab in the capital, called the Image Tower, as he held the highest position among those gathered there, and also held the title of the most powerful Archmage. Because of this, Angil was called the Great Sage. In his thoughts, Light grew more confused, asking himself if it was truly Sir Angil in front of him. Angil, hearing this, began to laugh in Light's face. After this, he simply asked Light to call him Angil, as it was no longer so important. Light froze again in pure shock, trying to respond, but he couldn't gather his thoughts to say even a single word. He had some distinct states. His position was also different, but Angil, like Light, possessed rather rare attributes. Angil's attribute seemed to appear once in every million years, known as the attribute of nothingness. This allows him to master all types of magic, granting him permission to control fire magic, earth magic, water magic, among others. However, it came at a high price, as increasing his magic level was extremely slow. Nevertheless, even if his magical power increased, the power gained was very small and weak, and even after a lifetime, he might never reach the maximum level of a mage. Many adventurers abandon this title or their adventuring career as the attribute is said to be worthless, and the attribute of light is seen the same way. To them, it's considered a failure. However, Angel did not give up. He entered the magic tower and, using his financial resources, ended up creating a method to restore his magical power almost instantly. After that, his attributes gained new meaning. Thus, Angel became the master of all attributes. However, Light ended up remembering a day when he felt his heart would explode with injustice. As he passed through the street, he overheard some people speaking ill of him. To disguise his reaction, he pretended to read a newspaper in his hand. Nevertheless, after hearing Angel's story and learning how he managed to change his life, our Light began to smile and was truly happy to meet Angel. Distracted by his thoughts, he ended up shaking his head, shouting that he couldn't call Angel by that title as he had asked, since it was now something awkward for Angel. Nervously, he waved his hand, trying to confirm his recently spoken words. Angel didn't insist that Light call him by an abbreviated form of his name, but he did ask that he at least not be addressed as master. Without waiting for Light's response, he continued speaking with him and then wondered if he agreed. But Light calmed and froze for a moment, trying to understand what he was talking about. Instead, Saya responded for him. She grabbed his hand, saying she had just been trying to invite him to her group. Light said his name in shock, then asked her to wait and wondered if she was really inviting him to be participating in the Angle group where the most powerful hero was. Saya ended up smiling a proudly incredible smile right there and exclaimed that it was really what he had just heard. Then she kind of pulled a thin chain hanging from her neck, taking out a space where our balloons were. What she took was an amulet showing what her rank would be, and here we saw that her classification was very high. But Light focused more on other things, since, well, that thing was basically in her precious place. At that moment, he couldn't contain his emotions, but Saya didn't pay attention to it and, suddenly embarrassed, said it was all thanks to Angel, for without him she wouldn't have managed to get here. Yet these words made Light calm down a little, and then he looked intently at Saya. At that moment, Angel refused to say those words, for he was sure that without this help, she managed to reach the maximum of her power, and right there she became a powerful person. At that moment, Saya didn't respond, but simply raised her palm upwards, and Angel then ended up smiling and took her hand. He was just watching all this, and now he began to understand some things that, in his mind, he noticed Saya was already in another group. And mentally, he understood that he didn't belong to that group. But at that moment, he had a memory of Saya from the past, from childhood, when little Saya happily shouted Light's name. In the moment, he closed his eyes, realizing here that he understood nothing could be done at that moment. He couldn't believe what was happening and also couldn't believe what was close to Saya, but he was distracted in his thoughts when he heard someone who hadn't been here for a long time. Cusco then approached Light from behind, placing his hand on his shoulder, and then he spoke seriously, saying he had just seen someone with a broken heart, and Light hadn't expected such an appearance. Cusco then stepped back, and in the next moment, he turned to Cusco. Then he shouted in surprise, asking why he appeared so suddenly there. He didn't understand what Cusco was doing in that place, and Cusco announced it was simple, as he now was part of the same Angel group. These words spoken by him ended up greatly surprising Light, and Saya confirmed what Cusco had said, as he mentioned he had left the orphanage and returned to the adventurer's path, as he had an attribute called Holy. Therefore, Cusco helped Angel with his restoration magic. Light found it quite difficult to understand all the information he had learned today, but Light continued to look at Cusco, still confused. He began to remember that moment when Light was still a little boy at the orphanage, and Cusco, upon returning, called him a failure and a loser with a weak ability. At that moment, this made Light frown, thinking this was strange. A group consisting of two people he knew as well as a great sage. But he couldn't keep pondering about it because Cusco ended up drawing his attention to himself. He asked if he would accept their request. He noticed how much they needed him. Light lowered his head, then realized that in his mind something told him he should refuse this request and not move forward. But again, he was distracted, being asked to agree at once, as Light's help would be much needed to achieve certain things. With a look softened, Light then looked at Seiya, who kind of pressed her palms together on his, asking if he really remembered his old promise. She then approached Light, holding the hem of his clothing with both hands, and Light remembered when this happened when they were together before the test. Seiya looked into his eyes, smiling, believing they would travel together. These memories then made Light abandon his urge to disagree, so she ended up agreeing, announcing that he would be making a request for them a little later. At the tomb of the King of the Dead, Light, Seiya, Angil, and Cusco advanced toward a slightly darker cave ahead. Light was very scared of the environment around him, covered in sweat. He asked himself if this sensation was frightening. He knew he was a rank D hunter, and he shouldn't be there, and to try to cope with his horror, he gripped the straps of his backpack tightly with his hands. Angel basically announced that they should be moving forward, but Light practically paid no attention to his words. He ended up thinking it was just a difficulty level of the tomb of the King of the Dead, and didn't understand why he had agreed to go with them. His friend heard Angel saying they were basically there because he had deciphered the documents he had really found, mentioning that inside there was a very powerful artifact. Since not everyone managed to understand what Angel meant when he talked about the artifact, he asked again, and Angel confirmed it. He explained that the artifact could transform into air magic and could be returned to the owner. In other words, this artifact could grant a person unlimited magical power. In this case, there would basically be no need to recover or run out of energy. These words made Light look at Angel, who basically had a magic reservoir hanging on his back, surrounded by a faintly glowing aura of light. He noticed that Angel possessed a large magic reservoir. According to Angel, he had created the core on his own. Continuing to look at the tank, Light then mentally noted that even though Angel had all the attributes, his original magical power couldn't be that high. In this case, he supposed that all that power needed something extra to supply all the power he had. Now, Light realized that Angel wanted to obtain the most absolute power, but suddenly, distracted in his thoughts, a skeleton out of nowhere jumped toward him, extending its hand to grab our hero. Light shouted and tried to dodge, but before anything happened, a bright magic energy beam sliced through the air, completely destroying the skeleton. Angel was the one who created this attack. After destroying the skeleton, he asked if Light was okay, then advised him with a smile to stay in the rear. Light just agreed with this, and then ran as close as possible to his group. For some reason, this group didn't have a warrior vanguard. Instead, the vanguard was represented by Angel, along with Seiya and Uncle Cusco, who were in the back ranks. Light had to keep an eye on the center, and in the end, he had to shine in an abnormal situation. Already, according to the Light, that information would be lost, but the situation wasn't normal. Suddenly, Seiya, laughing, activated her magic, promising that all the monsters would burn to the bone. Then, a powerful flow of flames started to spread throughout this entire cavern. Everyone began to obey her command, and started to attack all the monsters that were in front of them. Engel wasn't anxious about what was happening at that moment. He then activated Ingris's thunder, which ended up appearing as a lightning bolt. This lightning ended up destroying some monsters in front of him, letting none get close. Having finished one of the attacks, Seiya, meanwhile, activated a fire attack, not stopping smiling, confident in herself. She and Angel didn't stop attacking for a single moment, and they began to destroy the skeleton and monsters that approached. Meanwhile, Light froze completely. His mouth opened in astonishment, and he could only mentally admire them for seeing that they were powerful. Now he understood the real power of an A-rank group. However, Light doubted something, and as if he had foreseen a bit of his thoughts, Cusco then placed his hand on his shoulder and asked if he really thought they didn't need to hire someone like him. He explained the question, saying that the team was very strong and that the lighting could be solved with high magic equipment. Light then, again startled by the unexpected appearance of Cusco, started to run to the side. At first, he wanted to say that Cusco's assumption was wrong, but in the end, He just agreed. Cushhandle. Then he asked Light to look at it, and a light appeared in this place. It was basically magical illumination, but that began to absorb the magic stone. And with great attention, very surprised, Light began to notice that suddenly it started to darken and evaporate. Cusco suddenly pulled out a slowly glowing stone. This stone was attached to a small wooden handle. Then he asked Light to look at it, and a light appeared in this place. It was basically magical illumination, but that began to absorb the magic stone, and with great attention, very surprised, Light began to notice that suddenly it started to darken and evaporate. Cusco explained that this was the dungeon that consumed magic, so magic tools in this dungeon could turn into weapons, specialist in attacks, and the warriors did not have enough magical ability to deal with the Tao, and of course, without the magical tools. In a situation like this, it would be difficult to deal with monsters like these. Besides, physical attacks were almost useless against the undead. Light then understood that his magic was basically the main magic needed here. The skill of our hero was required. Cusco then confirmed this by looking at a bright ball of light created by Light. Then he begins to think that with this illumination magic, it was necessary, since with it, they could make a normal attack within this magic. More and thanks to Light, Seiya and Angelos could be fighting alone there, and already with Light's support, they managed to fight and managed to advance further also, due to the fact that his magic was free of obstructed sight. Hearing these words, Light smiled and felt a little more embarrassed, happy that his light magic was helping a ranked group. This joy specifically increased by the fact that Light understood that his attributes were more successful. Finally, after some time, Angelos announced that he had basically cleared the majority of the undead in this area and suggested that they rest a little. Seiya then approached Angie, then lay down on her hand, closing her eyes. We see her saying that she was very tired. Angie smiled and thanked Seiya for her support, and she, distracted by her sadness, ended up somewhat happy and began to laugh, then closed her eyes, tilted her head, then resting it on Agilus's shoulder. Light observed all of this in the background, somewhat displeased, since he liked the girl there who was flirting with the guy from the team while he thought this mentally. We then see Cusco appear, offering them a free healing. Then he puts his hand slightly forward. Then, well, after all that, he made a very bright magic circle appear over their feet, which then turned into healing magic to heal. He then approaches, his hands forming a sphere of light that moves toward him, and then from there, a giant aura appeared around the two, quickly healing their wounds. To do this, he closed his eyes to concentrate a bit more. Cusco also decided to use a little more healing magic energy there to restore faster, only for extra concerns, then quickly extended his arms to the sides to further expand his healing magic. After all of this, he ordered the wicked here to leave. Angel Cusco finished using the magic and said he had basically cleared the whole area of those who could still rise. Light, on the other hand, looks at his palm at this moment and wonders what he could do in a situation like this, then closes his eyes to ease concentration, which then activated the shield, and the light magic is released and spreads in all directions around the space here, forming a magic circle. Seiya and Argylus shouted in joy and smiled at our hero. After a moment, they looked at some bright light particles in the air. Light explained that while this magic was active here, it would be difficult for monsters to get close. Smiling, Angelos admitted that he was happy for Light to be in this place, and Seiya also smiled and thanked Light, as now they could rest a little more in peace. Light felt a little content for helping the people here quite a bit. He also sighed that although he had helped a little, just not that much. But he ends up changing the subject. Agil suddenly declares that this was incredible, observing that he could not believe that Light managed to maintain a high-level magic counter the power level. Light, holding his hair with his hand in an awkward manner, said it was all because of the amount of Huma, Angelo then said he was sure it was wonderful and mentally noted that it was just a great blessing to have Jad with them, since he was considered a sacrifice of Angelos at this moment. Light unsuspectingly thought that Angel was thinking something much worse than they imagined, at the end, smiling because the kid couldn't do anything else. A little later, they lit a campfire to cook certain things without waiting for the food to get, I don't know, ready. Saya fell asleep with her head on Angelo's lap, who was sitting there right by her side. Cusco also fell asleep because he couldn't stay awake for very long. At that moment, Light started to notice that the food was basically ready and then served it on a plate for our Angelo so that he could eat. Angelo began to taste it and exclaimed that now this here was delicious and noticed that Light actually knew how to cook quite well. Light then closed his eyes and started smiling again. And after that, he simply thanked Angelo for those kind words because he was happy that he liked his food. Angelo set the food aside a little and then placed the palms of his hands on the girl's head, whom our hero even liked. Seeing this scene, Light felt a bit sad noticing it. So suddenly, to escape this kind of thought, he pointed at Angelo's device, which he had carried with him up until now, and wondered if that thing he carried wasn't too heavy. Angelo deduced that he was talking about a magic reservoir, and Light confirmed this. Angelo admitted that it was indeed heavy, but flexing his arms in a way that showed his biceps, he exclaimed that, on the contrary, it actually provided him with great strength. He laughed afterward, and Light asked if it wasn't true that carrying magical power with him wasn't an amazing invention. Angelo explained that it was simply customary for him, saying that Light knew how difficult it was to live with attributes that were considered negligible. Light froze without responding, and Angelo, lowering his head slightly, said there was a limit to how much he could use magic transfer. Magic transfer was the exchange of magic with another person and was a universal skill in the sorcerer system. But in practice, the ability to acquire magic wasn't very good, as the magic that came to him was sometimes too little and low. Therefore, magicians didn't necessarily need to have a large amount of magic. Forcing a smile, Angelo admitted that he thought, in Light's case, this wasn't something particularly important, as he wanted to say something else. But Light, interrupting his words, ended up saying that if it were widely used, all his advantages could be enhanced. Angelo then placed his hand on his tank and asked him not to worry about it, as it wasn't something that could be mass-produced. That tank was the only one he had, and the fact that it was heavy or even bulky was a disadvantage. But Angelo was confident that with it, he could go as far as possible. Light, without understanding what all this meant, asked Angelo if he could go, and Angelo then raised his head and then explained how he could reach heights of incredible power. With this, he opened his eyes in such happiness, and he didn't know how to respond. He didn't know what else a young man with the title of a great sage could do. But one thing was certain, could do it, and for someone who is like him, receiving this motivation from this guy here, it was as if he understood his thoughts. Ansel says that he wanted to be a Hans and Light. In the end, he ended up asking something again about one of his thoughts, about those who, Ansel, on the other hand, lowers his head sadly. Maybe not, since right after he says to us that he was the youngest in the family. So all he received was only his last name, and because of that, clenching his fists, he decided that he should make that legend the legend of his family and managed to achieve the long-dreamed Anzil, and then he would be using his fists to achieve this, shouting with his last words. Anzil kind of frowned. What we should show here is that his gaze became a bit harder and more potent. Light then observed Anzil, a little excited and happy, as he promptly announced that this was why he truly needed the staff of the King of the Dead. If with that, he could gain infinite magical power and could use his powers without any restrictions. And in the end, his wish there would come true. In the end, we see him looking at the campfire burning brightly. Ansel adds one more thing, that he would do almost anything to get that staff. And so, he ends up smiling again in a slightly different way, with a terrorized expression. Light was a bit scared upon seeing his expression, and a drop of sweat appeared on his cheek. At that moment, Ansel suddenly froze as he realized that something had happened again, a thing that had happened quite often. Then he approached Light and apologized for the terrifying expression he had made. Light, on the other hand, said there was nothing wrong with that. Some time, minutes, passed. The fire went out, and Ansel thanked Light for the food he had made and said he needed to rest a bit. Light, without saying anything, started looking for some things in his backpack until he finally pulled out a magical energy stone. He looked silently at that thing for a few minutes. After a while, he asked if the attributes there would rust, because even though this was a magical tool, they couldn't use it for anything else. Ansel, on the other hand, started smiling with a fake smile and said it wasn't quite like that, explaining to him that this was specifically made to survive in a type of dungeon like the one they were currently in. For them, it was quite an important investment. Ansel thanked him for that. After that, he admitted that, in truth, Light was his most valuable companion. Now that I've reached this point, the positive side of this story was that this guy is very bad at lying, but the good thing is that our protagonist, on the other hand, believed everything he said. So what do we need to do? Accept and follow the story, right? After that, he used a light magical aura that started to spread throughout the area. As they advanced in the dungeon, the enemies became a bit stronger. Their numbers increased quite a lot. However, despite getting closer, they did almost nothing, as Ansel used some lightning magic arrows, and he also activated a fire tornado, eliminating the Light, on the other hand, once again admired his opponents in his mind for their strength, no longer believing in his own. His strength destroyed all the monsters that were in his way. Then they arrived at the tomb of the King of the Dead. In the double tomb of the King of the Moors, there was an aura surrounded by sharp magical stones, and there the hero saw that there was a special support where the staff of the King of the Dead was placed. Light, Angel, and Saya froze, staring fixedly at that thing with excitement about who should take it. Light, sweating and paying close attention, noticed something a little high above. He realized that there were many monsters along the way, but none were present there, not a single monster. However, there was a large number of coffins near that staff. Light didn't know what might happen if the monsters awakened all at once. Lost in thought, he was distracted when he heard someone calling him. Turning quickly, Light showed that he was listening, and it was Angel, the crazy one, calling for Light and asking him not to fall asleep here. Angel then asked Light to bring that staff. Light, shocked, asked why he had ended up receiving this mission. Horrified, he began simply shaking his head, saying no, explaining to us that he did not agree with this. But Jew, on the other hand, asked him not to worry, promising to do everything to protect Light since, of course, without the staff, he would not have infinite power, right? And once again, Jew believed it. He even started smiling, saying that Light would be helping them. So Saya and Kusu gave everything of themselves to help. After all this, Light finally agreed and advanced. As he moved forward, he realized everything seemed safe and relaxed. He could simply proceed. Even so, Light knew something was wrong. He felt it. But still, he pressed on. He approached the staff of the King of the Dead, sweat dripping from the corners of his lips. Wrapping his palms around it, he lifted the staff upward. At that moment, something appeared very suddenly, much larger than Light. Seeing this, Angel shouted for Light to throw the staff to him. He didn't care what happened to Light. The staff was the priority. As mentioned before, with the staff, they could win. Still, our protagonist frowned, but was determined to complete his mission. He extended his hand and threw the staff toward Angel. The staff flew past the monsters, and in the end, Angel caught it effortlessly. Then he laughed, calling Light basically an idiot. He couldn't believe Light had actually done it. Even Saya, standing there, laughed a little nervously, as if now everything had finally ended well. Our protagonist, once Angil's childhood friend, realized it no longer mattered to her. They thanked Light for his help, and as he turned to leave, he froze. What we then saw were his wide-open eyes and their malevolent smiles spreading throughout the place. The entire team announced that Light had now contributed greatly to their group. Now paralyzed, Light mentally understood that of course it was clear. He had believed in the idea that someone needed him. Well, his talent was useless. At least he was happy that someone nearby recognized his power. He only wanted to embark on the adventure with the people he considered friends. Looking at him, we realized that nothing he imagined had come true. The poor guy here. He just only wanted to take advantage of his usefulness. And most importantly, he remembered how Saya invited our hero to go on an adventure together. Light mentally noted that he wanted to take a turn in this story, a real turn, and managed to get out as an adventurer too, also managing to leave with her. But distracted in his thoughts, Light heard someone laughing and focused his gaze. Then Saya quickly turned to Angelo, and he remembered that Angelo had said everything here would be simple with Light. These words made Light freeze, perplexed by this. He screamed Angelo's name, but he didn't scream in reality. He only screamed in his thoughts, reinforcing his arms to see who was stronger. He began activating his light magic to try to distract the monsters somehow, pushing them back. He asked himself if this was really how he was going to die in a place like this, here and now. At that moment, Light felt like a disposable tool, but he wasn't ready to give up so soon. Screaming, he continued to use his light magic, activating sacred light shortly after. When the monsters saw this light, they began to get scared by the magic and retreated a little. Light took advantage and made a few steps backward because ahead of him, he saw that there was an exit. Determined to get out of here alive at any cost, he moved through a gap in the crowd of skeletons, throwing himself toward it. However, when one of the skeletons approached, he furrowed his brow. After that, he used sacred light to drive the monster away. Light then ran, thinking that before his magic could run out, he needed to find an exit. He realized the monsters would never stop coming. Light noticed that if he couldn't maintain an adequate level of mana, he would basically be devoured by them. He ran, gritting his teeth, focusing on the brightness in the darkness in his eyes. He continued to use sacred light, then ran in different directions to avoid being caught by surprise. He screamed too, but an attack came, breaking his focus a bit. Even so, he kept moving forward, carving out a small opening. Light followed this path, which led him to the entrance of a tomb. He decided he needed to go as far away from this place as possible. Our hero put his trust in himself and ran a lot. But then, out of nowhere, blood splattered in the air. Light stopped, covering his mouth with his hand. He fell to his knees, spitting up some blood. His breathing was becoming increasingly difficult. He realized this was a drawback of the magic. It made his blood flow not only from his mouth, but also from his eyes. He couldn't use magic anymore. In despair, he dug his fingers into the blood-stained ground, begging himself to stop. Light said in a broken voice that he wasn't ready yet. Groaning, he tried to do something, at least to try to save himself. His hands trembled, but he had a determination and he wouldn't give up so soon. So for that, he ends up ignoring some important parts, but these things kind of end up partially hitting the whites of his eyes, which kind of turned red. Suddenly, Light noticed a magical reservoir in front of him and asked himself what it was, since at first he didn't even remember that he didn't recall having an item like this here in front of him. But then suddenly he remembered and also realized that this mana reservoir in front of him belonged to Angil. And Light remembered that Angil had a staff, so he threw the tank aside with the last strength he had. He pushed himself forward and started moving towards the tank while light arrows he had created earlier were still there, holding back some desperate monsters. With his eyes closed, he crawled forward, pushing himself a bit, more because he urgently needed that mana. He didn't understand how to use that tank and thus assumed there was a switch. Before he could do anything, his arm suddenly kind of gave out, and he fell trembling on the ground. We see Light not giving up. He forced himself to get up again and finally managed to reach the tank. At the end, he placed the palm of his hand on it. After that, we then see the magic starting to be released towards him, filling Light completely. We finally see him being surrounded by a shell of magic. In the end, he felt that the magic filled our hero to the point of overflowing. Even though Light felt this, He suddenly froze and asked what that was since it was identical to his mana transfer sensation, but it was something different. However, Light couldn't think much about it because he heard a growl behind him. Returning to himself, he realized that some monsters had broken through the barrier he had created and were coming towards him. In the end, extending the palm of his hand towards them, he activated the holy light. A glow then launched towards the monsters, pushing them back. Other undead creatures took advantage of the fact that Light was distracted and tried to attack, but he used his magic again, which countered this attack. Swearing, he placed the tank on himself and tried to get up with it, deciding on his own that he should leave this place. However, the stairs were blocked by several skeletons. Light then used his will to open the way a little bit. Olit, who had been watching everything happening the entire time, decided to open his mouth. But as soon as he did, the glow began to get a bit more intense. Suddenly, Light turned around. Now he realized he was surrounded by a circle of magical energy. Then we see him at the end looking perplexed at this thing while his feet left the ground. The use of the magic slightly lifted Light into the air, unable to leave. He noticed the magic ending, which dropped him, throwing him to the ground. We see him just on the ground, his back in pain, completely battered. On the ground, he just laughed at the situation while Light merely observed silently, purely quiet. Light assumed he needed to defeat the boss and escape this dungeon. His face was basically marked by scars. Light asked what was happening at the entrance of this dungeon. He then assumed that by killing the boss, the door would open. Even if he managed to reach it, he wouldn't be able to cross. Light suddenly raised his hand and started using magic. After that, a fireball and a ball of magical energy formed next to his palm, which eventually turned into a magical circle, creating some patterns. Light was still on the ground and wasn't ready, and at that moment he noticed that a magical circle had formed above him. Different lights disappeared. Unlike others, this ability ended up forming something not good, and the atmosphere wasn't favorable. Suddenly, something from inside that circle came in his direction. To avoid being caught, Light began dodging some attacks. However, even dodging, he barely managed to avoid some strikes from the daggers. One of the blades then tore through the strap of the tank he was holding, making that thing fly to the side. Light could only scream mentally. However, he had a determined look on his face, knowing he had to find a way out of there. Then he remembered that he wasn't the same as before. Now, he was filled with magic, and because of this, he thought he had a chance to survive. So he launched himself and extended his hands to activate his sacred light magic. As he extended them, he activated his sacred light, and a considerable number of bright light spheres formed above him. In the end, knowing that this ability of his was low-level magic, he could use several light spheres against the monsters. Meanwhile, Light lowered his head, frightened. By the light of our hero, he then groaned and began advancing towards Light. He realized that if he could maintain this pace, the monsters would stay at a reasonably good distance. At this point, he could use this to defeat 2 monsters. But he stopped his thoughts, focusing on the fact that Light extended his hand to avoid magical attacks coming his way. Light didn't have much time to think, as the blades were coming to catch him. Suddenly, he was also hit, slightly wounded near his stomach. He froze at that moment. We now see that he was covered in sweat and pure fear. What dominated was only the pain. Light smiled. However, his body suddenly dissolved, which made the protagonist freeze instantly. The solar light attacks suddenly began falling on some monsters around, almost hitting him but missing because he used a type of light magic that created an illusion. Now that he had created this illusion, he promised to finish Light. He formed a new attack, clenching his fists. It also seemed that the power of this miasma was about to break. So he decided to launch a surprise attack from the front. Before launching his attack, he shouted for Light to receive his point-blank attack. Placing his body, he used the sacred light, sending an attack quickly in his direction. Light could only do one thing: close his eyes. He couldn't do anything else. Frustrated, he began flailing his arms to try to defend himself somehow, but in the end, it was useless. Monsters started to fall. Light thought that it was impossible to defeat a user of light who has 0 attack power. Despite that, he continued to fight, using his light firing rates. By using this several times, Light noticed that all the undead didn't like the light that much. If he kept going at this pace, then everything he was doing would work. Without stopping using his spell, he realized in the end that his confidence eventually reached its limit. Some of the monsters ended up weakening. Their arms fell, and everyone ended up collapsing to the ground from so much weakness. Noticing this, Light stopped using his attack. While being in the dark again in the cave, he looked closer at Lei. At that moment, he noticed that on his head, a faint light emanated from him because he still had a little bit of magic left in him. Suddenly, a system window appeared. Light, at that moment, looked at it, seeing that the light attributes had increased to level 10 of light magic. At this moment, he realized this was the highest level of light. In the end, he then thought about this, and the inscription changed slightly, indicating that the meteor shower magic had essentially been acquired. While thinking that he had finally reached level 10, Light ended up asking himself what all of this was leading to. But suddenly, Light's body seemed to extend and move toward his hand. Light looked at his feet and only noticed something enormous about to grab him. So, to avoid being caught again, he ended up dodging, jumping to the side. After forcing himself a bit, he stood up and, surprised, asked what was happening. How was Light still alive? But at that moment, he realized that this Lei was extremely furious. Besides being furious, he thought of himself as the superior in this entire fight. Then, noticing his superiority, he roared, opening his mouth. From another place, we see Light only closing his eyes. He put his hand in front of his face to protect himself from the wind that rose quickly. However, while observing this, he noticed that nearby, there were some stones emitting a glow. But these stones then started, in the end, to grow and quickly turned into something pointed and sharp. That then went in Light's direction. Light only thought of dodging, jumping to the side to avoid those pointed spikes. But not all his limbs managed to escape permanently. Some were caught and injured. Our story begins with Light, who suddenly started laughing, then opened his mouth. But after that, all we see is our hero raising his arms in front of his face. Then he closes his eyes as a strong wind blowing in his direction intensifies by the minute. He also notices that on the ground, some sharp stones suddenly begin to faintly glow. He starts planning a few things mentally as the stones grow to enormous sizes, transforming into sharp peaks. Now, to save himself, he must dodge. He jumps up, struggling to avoid the sharp spikes from touching him. Not even all the monsters could manage such a feat, and some of them ended up hanging on to the peaks. In the end, Light stood up, preparing for the next battle. Meanwhile, as he looked in another direction, we see drops of blood falling to the ground, blood that belonged to Light himself, now battered and bruised. Clenching his teeth, Light held his wounded shoulder, trembling violently with pain. At that moment, Light finally understood everything that was happening. He observed closely as our protagonist began to speak. Light asked if it was true that Lit wasn't such an easy monster to defeat. However, he added that the same situation was happening to him, and suddenly, smiling, his level started rising out of nowhere. Now he might be able to use magic that allowed him to wield more advanced spells. Thinking about this, Light created a sphere of light that shone intensely, illuminating the area. Upon activating this ability, light spread in every direction. He then unleashed a meteor shower. A massive number of solar particles formed in the air and began raining down, attacking the monsters and the Lich. The Lich roared as the hero's attacks hit it, and the flow of the shower grew stronger and stronger. Light remained focused, channeling the energy of the light magic, even as he suffered from its strain. Some of the monsters tried to escape, but it was impossible to evade the hero's attacks. Lit, too, could do nothing anymore. Finally, Light fell to his knees, exhausted after using so much mana in one decisive blow to try and defeat this boss. At the end, we see our hero supporting his entire body on one elbow, his head hanging down as he breathes more slowly and tries to recover his strength. After some time, he noticed the light had disappeared and realized the meteor shower had ended. Raising his head, Light began looking around to see if anything was happening, but the most important thing was lit. Looking at him, Light saw no sound was coming from him anymore. Hearing this silence, Light was overjoyed. He began to smile, happy that he had managed to defeat an enemy with his light magic. Relishing his luck, he began to laugh in happiness, but his laughter soon stopped. Light started trembling with fear. He noticed a strange light. Looking up, something dawned on him. And not just on him, but on some skeletons that appeared in the background. In shock, Light asked himself how all those monsters were still alive after such an attack. With a trembling voice, he pleaded for the monsters' stats to reveal themselves and looked at the image that appeared, freezing in place. A level 10 meteor shower had struck this specific area, hitting with more power than ever before, stronger even than the darkness that burned anyone's vision. But nothing happened. His skill had caused 0 damage. Surprised by this, Light asked what this meant. This was supposed to be the highest level magic, the pinnacle of its power. Realizing the situation, he stood up and looked at the horde of skeletons. Unharmed. Light then laughed. He understood that, even in the end, light magic had done nothing to help him. He just sat on his knees, and as he observed, he raised his head and started laughing again. The magic of Light was truly useless in the end, but seeing Light's despair, the monsters around him also became quite cheerful. Light said that Light was a pretty cool attribute, but gradually his laughter began to fade, to stop, and tears then welled up in his eyes. Mentally, he cursed everyone who was there. Light then twisted and looked at his hand, which had a bit of blood on it. However, the blood there was not ordinary blood. It was black blood. Light realized that magic had no meaning. What mattered was that he was doomed to die right there. Nonetheless, he shifted his gaze from his hand to a magical reservoir in front of him. He became a little more, calm, pausing to think for a moment. He decided that he needed the magic, but stopped before touching the tank. However, Light looked closer and noticed that there was basically a human hand emerging from that tank. His eyes widened, and he was quite shocked by the situation. Looking more closely at that visible hand over the broken area, Light froze again. Now, he wondered what on earth was that hand. He began to investigate further, but in the end, he just froze in horror. Finally, he realized it was a portable magic tank. Suddenly, he remembered Angio smiling and mentioning it was a heavy load. This realization horrified Light. He screamed coldly, calling out Angio's name. He then insulted him, covering his mouth with his hand and furrowing his brow. Mentally, he noted that Angio had sent nothing here. Suddenly, in his thoughts, he repeated Angio's words about how difficult this was and wondered, perplexed, how anyone could be doing something like this. Tired of the entire situation, he clenched his jaws with all his strength and started forcing the tank to tear apart certain parts of it. At that moment, our hero convinced himself that he should and must rescue that person inside the tank. Observing closely, he realized that this person could be freed. Finally, applying great force, Light gradually broke pieces of the magical reservoir until he managed to move the person a bit to the side. But at that moment, he caught a scent and then looked inside the tank. He saw Yumi, completely curled up at the bottom of the tank, lying there. He began to look at her, and Light asked, perplexed, if what was below was really a girl. Yumi, with the same noise from outside, didn't wake up. She simply remained there, lying, peacefully breathing through her open mouth. Light furrowed his brow, then pulled her out of the magical reservoir and placed her on the ground. Mentally, he exclaimed that she was still alive. As soon as he touched Yumi, her magical energy began to flow out of her. Light paid closer attention to Yumi's blonde hair, which reminded him that only living people or beings could transfer magic. Thus, he felt more at ease, realizing that Yumi was alive in the end. Still, he couldn't control his emotions after seeing Yumi in such a magical tank. With extreme anger, he clenched his fists, realizing she had spent some time inside that thing and hadn't been properly fed. Likely, she wouldn't be able to walk for a while. Now, kneeling and holding her, he decided he would carry her, in his arms so that her head would not touch the ground. Light then looked at his surroundings and realized that magic was flowing near him. At this moment, he stopped because he remembered that the first time he touched that tank, he saw that the magic was basically being transferred to him. But he didn't know that this magic came from Yam. If he had somehow discovered that the magic came from her, he would have acted in a very different way. Now, knowing everything, our hero just hugs Yam, and then simply apologizes to her for those fools who had done this to her. Yam did not react in any way, but kept her eyes closed. Meanwhile, the skeletons nearby were already getting too close to him. They planned to attack Light, who was sitting there with his back to them. Still distracted, Light apologized and asked Yam to use her magic. After a long time, the monsters getting closer to him made Light notice their presence. Clenching his teeth, he turned toward the undead and then activated the holy light. The flash scared the skeletons. Light thought it was just a walking torch. With the magic reservoir, he remembered that he was often ridiculed by everyone for being different. However, Angel had done something entirely different from the others. Something that Light cursed while sweating. He used his magic to push the monsters back. After all of this, he realized he should never stoop to the level that Angel had essentially sunk to. For this reason, he told Angel that he had ended up taking some lives, which was good for him. He hadn't come here to save the dear friend he had, but oh well, Light didn't care about Angel anymore. Now he was doing what was necessary to reach the top. Now he realized that Angel had acted like this from the beginning, using Light as a pawn to obtain the sacred staff. However, to achieve this, Angel then used the defenseless girl, laughing. We then see Light frowning in the distance. We can also observe the anger coming from our hero's mouth. Then he just screams that he will not forgive Angel in any way for doing this. Quickly, he stood up, still holding Yam, and activated several new flashes of light to open the way. First, he needed to get out of there, but he would not leave that cave or this place alone, because he would take Yam with him. He didn't care what was going to happen, because whoever crossed his path, he only promised himself, whoever got in his way would die. Well, somehow, before anything else, he just asked Yam to lend him a bit more of her magic. After that, he decided to do something else. Looking straight ahead, filled with rage, he said he would make Angel pay dearly for what he had done. Now he was 100% foaming with rage, seeking a good battle he was about to have. Then, we observe Yam's body beginning to release energy more strongly than before. This energy started enveloping Light's body with an aura of light that spread throughout the place where they were. In the end, we see something forming there. What formed was basically something that would protect them significantly. Light, frowning, ended up asking the skeleton in front of him to disappear, but it wouldn't obey. For this reason, he activated his maximum impact. Consciously, he ended up activating the Holy Light ability. A large number of brilliant light arrows appeared around the monster. But this was linked because it ended up pursuing the skeleton. Now that the attack hit the skeleton, he realized that his attack didn't even cause a single point of damage. He realized that this would at least help him escape this situation. However, regarding his light, he also noticed that it was the brightest light he had ever seen. So, for him, he understood that this should already be enough to open the way. On a path, he suddenly began breathing heavily but continued to use magic. Suddenly, he noticed that a panel appeared in front of him, announcing that the maximum level of light magic had been reached. Thus, Light stopped using his magic, but after seeing the screen again, he ended up reactivating it to try to reach an even higher level of light magic. While doing so, the skeletons became increasingly irritated by the bright flash. They began covering their eyes with their hands, but Light continued to push them back to use this to his advantage to escape along with Yam. He ignored the system's warnings about the excessive strain he was putting on himself. By basically not listening to the system, he began to cough up some blood, but he wouldn't stop. He kept fighting. Yam remained unconscious, and Light continued advancing. Time and again, the system warned him about the maximum level of light magic he was using. After receiving so many warnings, he simply ordered the system to stay quiet. He only asked for one thing: attack power. The system persisted with its warnings, which only increased our hero's frustration. He then ordered the system to shut up once and for all. Suddenly, he froze, covered in sweat. He only saw Lit's finger, and out of nowhere, he began to weaken, letting go. In the end, Yam fell to the ground, followed shortly by Light collapsing at his side. Light remained standing and only saw in the end Lit's finger there in the middle of his stomach. At that moment, he was startled by Lit's size, but at that moment, he couldn't do anything else. Lit was completely enraged. He then pulled his finger back, causing a massive jet of red liquid to gush from our hero. Exhausted from the pain, Lit fell to the ground near Yam. Seeing that his body was also useless, he began to grow angrier. His face turned red, veins began to bulge, and then he simply stood up with confidence, pressing one hand against the wound in his stomach while extending the other forward. At that moment, he just started laughing and declared that he wouldn't lose to a mere undead. Then he activated the magical light energy that formed in the palm of his hand. He decided to survive. The system table displayed a notification to our hero that his light magic level had reached a specific error. Surprised, he asked, a status error?" After seeing this, his hand simply started to tremble. In the end, he began denying that what had just happened was possible, shouting that he had run out of magic. His face showed horror as he faced a massive army of skeletons in front of him. The system table indicated that the upper limit of magic had been reached. In this moment of confusion, he looked at the table, which now displayed a message about the evolution of the light attribute. Now he wondered if he really wanted to evolve light magic into light ray magic. With wide eyes of surprise, he asked, "Evolution to a ray of light?" After a moment, a choice appeared: yes or no. With a very serious and serene expression, he asked himself, "Should I accept this proposal?" Without wasting time, of course, our protagonist extends the hand and presses confirm. The flash appeared before his eyes. Soon after, an intense brightness illuminated the entire area around him. He covered his face with a quick movement of his hand so that at least he wouldn't go blind from this light. He cursed after seeing this strong light coming into his face. An incredible light then emanated from the system table. He opened his eyes and looked at the table. Now he doesn't understand how or what just happened with his stats. The table showed his level 15. His name, Light, remained the same. He somehow ended up managing to get the occupation of low-level adventurer, but also his attributes were listed as the light of the beam of light. At that moment, he also had access to several levels of light mage, including the first level of light, the second level of light ball, and the third level of mirage. The table also indicated the new available spells, such as the first level of laser. Then an inscription appeared declaring that if he wanted to evolve a light attribute spell into a beam of light spell. A beam of light spell? What kind of ability was that? Confused, he asked if a beam had been added there. Looking closer, he realized that yes, there was a new spell. He looked at the description informing about the first level laser, which ended up leaving him confused. Then, a bright, magical light energy began to appear next to his finger. Surprised by this, he screamed as the bright blue energy emanated from his finger. Shocked by this, he thought about everything but knew that what he really needed to think about. Our story today begins at a moment where Lich stared fixedly in the direction of those monsters. A serious explosion began to happen. Light pointed one of his fingers at Lit. Then he launched an attack. A rather large amount of luminous energy balls formed around his finger. Afterward, the system screen displayed essentially a new move, and then he ended up shouting, ordering the attack to be released. With a battle cry, he sent a magical energy beam towards his opponent. The bright beam aimed directly at Light's skull and that creature right away. Then it looked startled at our hero, only to simply widen its eyes. The beam of light then hit Light's head, illuminating the entire skull of that thing. The weak skeletons watched, mouths agape. Soon after, Light raised his finger. We saw that it ended up illuminating a specific area of his finger a lot. To add to it, Light ended up sort of blowing Light's skull into the air, which was simply destroyed. The skeletons just kept watching, mouths open. Then Light ended up falling backward at Light's feet. In the end, magical energy started gushing from a place where his head was. Light looked at it, quite surprised, and asked himself, "What is this?" He noticed a hole suddenly appearing in that Light's skull. In the end, this light ended up melting like glass in the heat. He saw the melted stone dripping down the wall, and with a trembling voice, he ordered the system status to be opened. A golden table glow appeared right in front of his astonished face. He saw that the table displayed new things. A level 1 magical light ray. The description explained that the laser could penetrate anything it wished with an adjustable power, depending on the amount of magical energy. This ranged perhaps from 100,000 to infinity. Shocked, he asked, 100,000 is the minimum attack power? At that moment, he felt happy, because his attack power had previously been 0. Confused, he asked again, 100,000. With a big hole in his stomach, he ended up feeling perplexed. But at that moment, those furious spiritual skeletons approached from behind him with a battle cry. Light knew he was basically in an A-class dungeon, and everyone there feared him. At that moment, he also remembered rumors that the undead numbered in the thousands, but remained undaunted. After this, he raised his finger again, and blue energy appeared around it. Then he shouted that this was the power he needed. With a very serious expression, he declared that these undead here now were nothing to him. He then launched a magical energy light beam towards that undead skeleton horde. The beam then hit the skeletons, causing them to scream. Light shouted for those ghosts to disappear. The skeleton's head finally ended up flying into 1,000 pieces. The skeleton that remained looked fearfully at its companion being defeated. Thanks to Light's evolution, he had reached another level. However, his blood ended up stopping its flow. He placed his hand on his stomach, thinking the magic had returned to him. But in the end, our Light simply raised his hand upward. But he also realized he was quite weak. However, for him, it was a very high attempt. Looking at Yumi, looking to the side, he ended up smiling. He thanked her for saving him, and as he had promised before, he would fulfill the favor he had promised earlier, to get her out of there. With determination, he shouted, "Forward!" Thus, a combat stance was assumed, and on his finger once again appeared. "Some light?" He commanded a beam of light with his gaze. That pain, with his mouth already open, he ended up sort of ordering these beams of light to destroy all the undead in the area. The beam of light he sent went toward the undead, annihilating each one of them. With a battle cry, he directed perhaps another beam of light to destroy his rivals atom by atom. Light shouted loudly, shattering the skeleton's bones one by one. With rage, he declared that their skulls would be separated from their bodies. After destroying countless skeletons, the system interface appeared, notifying him that Adventurer Light had leveled up while he decapitated the last of the skeletal army still standing. Afterward, he received many notifications that his level had increased. Directing a different beam of light in various directions, he thought that if he could maintain his power in this state, it would last for a long time. With broad gestures of his hand, he directed the beam of light to the side, obliterating all the undead surrounding him. With a tense expression, he stated that he would take her away from this dangerous place. In the end, he would show her something. The sky she had been deprived of seeing because she was trapped in this coffin. He looked down, recalling the images he had just seen moments ago, and reflected that everything he had lived through might have been difficult. His eyes turned blood red, and with a wild expression, he burned everything around him. Immediately after, he looked at his hand, where he saw a beam of light. He screamed, and then screamed again, showing that the undead were in danger. Guess who would be hunting those undead? Himself. At that moment, his face was covered in bruises and cuts, the result of the battle he had just endured. But afterward, with sheer rage, he raised his hand, sending a beam of light soaring high. He aimed it in the direction where his group might possibly be. Elsewhere, Cusco was walking through the cave until the ring of light launched by our protagonist appeared. They wondered, what kind of ray is this? The ray cut through the entire mountain, scattering fragments in all directions. Light looked up, quite surprised, as sunlight fell on his face. He saw how many meters of rock the ray had pierced. After looking at the light and wondering, "Light! How did I manage to see this light?" He realized his face was bleeding slightly. The reason was sheer exhaustion. He then collapsed to the ground, utterly spent. Moments later, the man opened his eyes and looked at our hero, lifting his head toward the sunlight. It didn't take long for light to fire again. Angelo and Cusco were walking through the stone cave. Angelo wore a somewhat serious, irritated expression, muttering curses at what was in front of him. He thought that the darkness made him uneasy, unable to relax. But then he remembered and asked himself if he wasn't as useless as he thought. He wanted to be useful, perhaps even as bait. Suddenly, skeletons hiding behind the rocks attacked. But quickly, Angelo managed to finish them off with a single strike. He shouted for these monsters to disappear. The explosion of the undead followed, with green magical energy beginning to affect the skeletons. Angelo cursed vehemently, with a serious and tense expression, pointing his hand at the skeletons. A crushing ray was then released in multiple directions, smashing, then pointed the hand towards the skeletons. But in the moment, scared, this one ran and held his hand, but ordering him to step back. He came here. Some noise was basically making the undead come from the depths as quickly as possible to this place. Saya, with her face red with tension, screamed that she couldn't take it anymore. Large tears filled her eyes. Angelo looked at her with a, let's say, threatening look, and after a while they stopped in the cave. Angela, on the other hand, said she had basically gotten rid of the pursuer for now. Saya was bent over, struggling to catch her breath after that run. Angelo turned to her and told her to use magic, explaining that it was the only option, but he didn't finish the sentence. Then Saya, in hysteria, raised her head, clenched her fists, and shouted that she was basically at her limit. She turned to Angelo, begging him to do something, only to ask afterward if he could be doing anything, since if he used light magic, they could do something. She added that he had everything, didn't he? Angelo looked at her without emotion, thinking it was useless. His eyes soon became basically blood red as he looked at her angrily, then frowned, thinking about what a stupid animal she was. He knew that he had brought her into the group because she looked pretty and also had quite a lot of strength. If it weren't for that, she wouldn't even be in the group anymore. For a brief moment, he even thought about throwing her away, but he realized he could get a little light from fire magic. Looking at her tear-streaked face while she was on the ground, he ended up approaching her gently. He hugged her from behind and, with a comic tone, said that if she wanted to get out of there, they needed her light. He added that even though he could use light magic, his magical power still wasn't very high. Even though he was still a heck of a, well, you know. And for that, he stared into her eyes. He said he basically needed to save his magic for more serious situations. Saya emotionally asked why he couldn't put or use his staff, then said that's exactly what he was for. She asked if it wasn't, and he answered her question with another question. What if it harmed him? He explained that he needed to study it. He also said they had to endure a little longer and asked her to start. She looked at him surprised, tears in her eyes, then lowered her gaze a bit. She recited the spell. The small fire formed in the palm of her hand, floating in the air. Angelo, at the moment, thought her light was very weak, and in the end, it lasted only a few minutes. They then walked until dawn, and he wondered if he could find a replacement for her. He then remembered that Yam had been thrown away, and maybe he shouldn't have discarded her earlier, because he still basically needed her at the moment. But in the end, he realized replacements could always be hired. More unexpected, basically frightening, sounds appeared. Angelo then asked himself in surprise what that was. He and Saya, terrified, basically clenched their hands while observing from a distance. Cusco approached and peeked at the ground. He shouted tensely that the earth was glowing. After that, drops of sweat started trickling down his face. For that, he ended up squinting his eyes. After that, they started staring fixedly at the entrances of these dungeons. Where there was a strong wind on the dungeon wall, a type of magma was forming at that moment. Angelo, perplexed, asked himself what that was. He then shouted loudly that he didn't understand anything anymore. He observed attentively as rays of light began to appear in the magma and then simply ordered it to flow immediately. After his command, an incredibly strong beam of bright energy launched each of them a bit upward, some meters backward. Their clothes began in the end to catch fire. They screamed in horror and fear as sweat started to appear, thinking their clothes had caught fire. Now on the other side, Seiya ended up grabbing her hat, terrified. Then we see Cusco shouting irritably, saying the fire was near. With a serious and frightened expression, he half dove with his hands into the flames, shouting. He announced that there was a bit of water ahead, so they needed to run. Sweat also poured from their faces as they performed this action. Seiya randomly adjusted her hands and shouted at the same time, also asking him to do something. She loudly requested, saying the most important thing was perhaps L, but some different contents basically ended up being poured over them from various containers. Seiya shouted in disgust, saying that goat milk basically smelled horrible. Cusco responded, shouting that the potions weren't among the best. Angelo noted that it was better than dying. Soon after, a piece of their clothing was on the floor, burning and emitting some smoke. Their shoes were burnt. The three were basically, well, their skin too, irritated with sad faces, though happy to have survived. Then we see their clothes, let's say, torn apart by the fire. Seiya screamed, lamenting that she was basically feeling very bad. Angelo then looked at her angrily, and at that moment Cusco noticed a hole and asked if that was connected to that tomb. He looked at the huge hole in the ground. Angelo looked up, surprised, and then noticed it was covered by it. Everyone then looked upward with their mouths open. Angelo noticed and said he could see the sky above. Confused, he asked about the magic of lit. Then he looked down and said he didn't see the light anymore. On the other hand, Seiya asked if it was true. Cusco crouched down and got a bit closer to that hole in the ground, turning to her to ask for some of the fire, adding that he thought the light seemed more like that. Irritated, she asked what he was talking about. He then extended his hand forward and said that the attribute of light was just a joke. Angelo turned to him and said that if it really was the magic of light, then everything was very bad. With a confused expression, he told her that if they had killed light, they would basically have the next steps to take. Seiya and Cusco then looked at him fearfully. Cusco described the situation as a disaster since light, in the end, was still alive. And if he gets out of there, everything for him will be destroyed, the future they had planned. For this reason, he then turned to Seiya and asked her to use her fire ability again and to do it as quickly as possible. She stretched out her hands toward her. The direction, with a serious expression, said for her to unleash that explosion toward our hero, since if she didn't do so, he himself would end it with her. With a very frightening expression on her face, she opened her mouth while casting a fire spell and said, "Okay." A short while after launching that fireball, something started to form. Angelo quickly turned to the side and then shouted for everyone to get out of there as fast as possible. Cusco and Seiya ran after him with a very serious expression, but the question remains, what kind of thing is this that ended up forming or caused this thing to form? To truly know what will happen from here on out, whether these traitors will actually die here in the cave or won't even have a chance to escape, we'll have to find out in the next part.